Hello everyone, welcome to the third Spotlight in March 2026. Time is flying, and this is a really interesting Spotlight, and I hope you've enjoyed the title, Satan and the Rebel Problem. So let's just begin, alright? So today, I have returned from the wilderness, near a beach where I like to surf, and living in my camper, I did a live stream, I hope you watched it, where I demonstrated the mechanics of making video recordings of UFOs or extraterrestrial spacecraft. Now you can still see the live stream on Farsight's channel on YouTube, which is just Farsight, or the edited and polished version of the live stream on farsightprime.com. And also during this week, the world continued to follow the path of coming apart, or in my words as I described in my previous Spotlight, entering the wilderness. But today I want to talk about something different, something more penetrating, something deeper. I want to talk about the deep psychology of revolution and the difficulty in determining who is the good side and who is the bad side, or if it is even possible to have a good and bad side. So we are talking about the anatomical power of a revolution, something rarely discussed openly today in contemporary political debates, but something that John Milton addressed directly. That's right, you heard it. You heard it right, John Milton, the Renaissance poet. Now, to enter this topic, I want to see it through the lens of one of my absolute favorite poets. And John Milton is my absolute favorite poet. And his epic poem, Paradise Lost. Well, friends, John Milton lived in the 1600s, a long time ago. And Paradise Lost focuses on the biblical story of the war in heaven and the fall of Adam and Eve. So there are two basic arcs in this work. The first is the arc of Satan and the revolution in heaven and the casting out of the fallen angels into the pits of hell. And the second arc concerns Adam and Eve, their seemingly idyllic lives, the temptation by Satan, and their forced departure from the Garden of Eden. So, in my view, John Milton wrote Paradise Lost not as a simple intellectual creation, rather, he wrote it from an intense mental state, and many consider Paradise Lost as almost a spiritual text rather than a mere epic poem. So it's important to note that John Milton was totally blind when he wrote Paradise Lost. And he wrote it by dictating it to his assistants. So Milton had a mental experience when writing Paradise Lost that was comparable to that of many prophets who later wrote texts that ended up as religious documents, such as the Bible. It was precisely because of Milton's mental intensity when writing Paradise Lost that he included content that I do not think he understood completely. Even himself, he didn't understand it. But the content is there, and it stares me in the face each time I read that work. So let's begin with the first arc, Satan and the revolution in heaven. And I will explain why that is relevant to us, super relevant to us, right now as the world is falling apart. You'll be very surprised. It's not a connection that you'd automatically think, but it's really powerful. So Paradise Lost is made up of 12 books or volumes. It's a poem, a long poem. Essentially, the biblical heaven is a monarchy with a father and a son. Now, there's no voting, no republic, no equality among peers. There's only obedience to authority, obedience to the Father God. Now, the son is more like an enforcer, the muscle, who forces everyone else to obey the Father and to punish those who choose not to obey the Father. Now, Satan, who early in the story is called Lucifer, he doesn't like the monarchy. Lucifer is more of a republic supporting sort of person. He greatly dislikes the idea of simply obeying the Father. Now, there are two essential aspects to this. The first is that no one in heaven has a beginning and an end. They are all eternal beings, just like you. And they're essentially equal in terms of their origins. So for all the other eternal beings to have to worship one chosen eternal being is, well, it's sort of irritating. What makes that one eternal being so special? That one eternal being cannot really be the Father, since all eternal beings have no starting point. This is like a monarchy in today's world. Why should a monarch be the one person who rules over all others in the kingdom? What makes that person special in any clearly identifiable way? Now, one should also remember that John Milton published Paradise Lost in two major editions, in 1667 and 1674, which was not long after the English Civil War that resulted in the execution of King Charles I in 1649 by beheading. That's right. Now, Milton lived through and even participated in that revolution. He wrote a document called The Tenure of Kings and Magistrates, where he argued that kings who become tyrants may be lawfully overthrown and executed. So Milton also served in the revolutionary government of Oliver Cromwell as well. So the revolutionary government eventually collapsed, and Charles II, the son, Charles II assumed the role of the new king, which was formerly held by his father. Now, Milton was then in a very bad political situation at that point, to say the least. He was politically defeated and he was blind. Now, the second edition of Paradise Lost was published the year Milton died. Blind and defeated. Well, it is for these reasons that numerous scholars have found Milton's treatment of Satan to be heroic in a truly positive sense. Lucifer, renamed as Satan, disliked the role of a worshiper, and he, together with his close companions, inspired a revolution against the prevailing monarchy. Now, Satan seemed to be arguing for a republican conception of government, where no one was given overarching power to rule all other creatures. And during the revolution, threatened with being banished to hell, he famously stated, "Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven." Now, that line is not merely a boast. It expresses a profound psychological commitment to autonomy. So Lucifer refuses to submit to authority, even if submission would grant him continued residence in heaven itself. So basically, Satan felt an intense refusal to submit to authority. He hated hierarchy, and he wanted autonomy, or what he felt was true freedom. Essentially, Satan was a free will absolutist, in many ways comparable to the psychology of the free will extraterrestrials who we at Farsight work with today. Basically, to all free will beings, they will not voluntarily abandon the autonomy of their existence. That's the nature of a free will being. So to understand the relevance of Paradise Lost for our present moment, like right now, one must first recognize that Milton was not writing about a distant mythological past. He was writing about a problem that existed in his own time and which continues to exist in our time. The deep psychological anatomy of a revolution. That's what he was writing about. So revolutions are rarely understood while they are happening. They're messy when they're happening, emotionally charged and filled with propaganda from all sides. Every faction claims to be the righteous one. Every faction claims to be defending justice. And yet, when the dust settles, history often looks very different from the slogans shouted during the conflict. So let's recap so that nothing is lost. Milton understood this problem deeply because he had lived through one of the most shocking revolutions in European history. Only a few years before publishing Paradise Lost, England experienced the English Civil War, a conflict that ended with the execution of Charles I. Now imagine the shock of that moment. For centuries, the prevailing doctrine in Europe had been the divine right of kings, which held that monarchs ruled by divine authority and therefore could not be legitimately overthrown by their subjects. Yet, in 1649, the English people did exactly that. They executed their king, chopped his head off. And remember that Milton did not merely observe these events, he actively defended them with his own writings and political activities. So it was not possible for Paradise Lost to be merely a treatise on religious doctrines of Christianity. Paradise Lost is a deeply political work, and that is why it's relevant to us today. So now let's be clear about what I am saying and what I am not saying. I am saying that Milton is revealing many admirable characteristics of the Satan character and of the revolutionary movement that occurred during the war in heaven. I am not saying that any modern-day conception of Satan or the devil is in any way comparable, nor am I saying that modern-day Satanism is a good thing in any way, shape, or form. Satan, Satanism, and the devil are just words, and the meaning of words has changed over time and across individuals and cultures. That is, modern-day Satanism has nothing to do with anything that I am addressing in this talk. Okay? So let us return to the first arc of the poem, Satan and the Revolution in Heaven. In Milton's telling, heaven operates as a pure monarchy. Authority flows downwards from the Father. There is no parliament, no vote, no republican mechanism of legitimacy. There is only hierarchy and obedience. Now Lucifer, again later called Satan, finds this system absolutely intolerable. The fundamental psychological problem is surprisingly modern. Lucifer and the angels see themselves as eternal beings. They have no memory of a beginning and no expectation of an end. And in that sense, they perceive themselves as existing on the same ontological level as any other eternal being. So, when God announces the supremacy of the Son and demands that all angels bow before him, Lucifer experiences something extremely powerful psychologically. Humiliation. That's right. So Milton describes the moment when Lucifer's pride is wounded, and the injury is not physical, it is psychological. And a question that emerges in Lucifer's mind that has driven countless revolutions throughout history is this: why should one being rule over all others? Why? Lucifer begins to reinterpret the structure of heaven through political language. And in one of the most striking lines in the poem, he asks, "Who can in reason then, or right, assume monarchy over such as live by right his equals?" The language is a little weird for that time period, but it's basically, who can assume the right of a monarchy to live and be supreme by the right, with regard to the right of his equals. It's like, it doesn't make sense. So notice what has happened. The theological hierarchy of heaven has suddenly been reframed as a political system of monarchy. And once the issue is framed in that way, Lucifer's argument begins to sound less like demonic rebellion and more like political revolution. So it's not surprising that many readers across centuries have found Satan to be an oddly compelling character. He speaks the language of autonomy. He speaks the language of liberty. He speaks the language of revolution. Now, this is where Milton's work intersects with what we have discovered through many projects at Farsight. Milton may have believed that he was writing a theological epic, but the structure he describes closely resembles patterns that we have been seeing repeatedly in our research into extraterrestrial civilizations. Across many projects at Farsight, we have encountered the same fundamental conflict. The tension between authoritarian systems that demand obedience and free will civilizations that refuse to submit. Now, at various points in galactic history, this conflict erupted into open warfare. One can think of it loosely as a cosmic civil war spanning large regions of the Milky Way galaxy. Now, popular culture has occasionally touched on this theme. The Star Wars films portray a struggle between an authoritarian empire and a rebellious alliance. So, while it is fictionalized, that narrative structure echoes a deeper pattern. At Farsight, we have investigated aspects of this history in projects such as The War in Heaven and the Aliens on Iapetus sessions. Those are two great projects. These projects suggest that our solar system itself once lay within a contested conflict of that larger conflict. It was a contested region inside that larger galactic region that was in conflict. So, according to these investigations, remnants of those struggles can still be seen today. The asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter appears to be the shattered remains of a former planet destroyed in one phase of that war. Winners and losers emerged from these conflicts. Some of the defeated factions eventually settled on Earth. The dominant authoritarian powers did not want those populations to regain strength, so Earth became a containment system, essentially a planetary prison. And you can see this theme echoing across many of our sessions, many of our projects at Farsight. You can see all of our projects on farsightprime.com, and they repeatedly rediscover that same general dynamic. So to maintain control over the human population, mythologies were created that demonized rebellion, calling them by names that they would teach everyone to fear and hate, like Satan and Lucifer. So these mythologies eventually evolved into organized religions. And then those organized religions told us who to hate. Week after week after week after week, going back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So from this perspective, the figure that we call Satan can be interpreted very differently. Rather than a supernatural embodiment of evil, Satan may represent a rebel leader whose story was retold by the victorious authoritarian side. History is, after all, always written by the winners. Well, from the perspective of those authoritarian authorities, Milton's treatment of Satan as a character is dangerously persuasive. Satan's arguments expressed in the poem often sound like revolutionary political arguments. It is Satan who declares, "Who can in reason then, or right, assume monarchy over such as live by right his equals. Remember that. And in the Satan arc of Milton's story, God proclaims and demands the Son's supremacy. Satan feels envy and humiliation. Satan reframes the issue as political tyranny. Satan persuades other angels that they are equals who should not submit. Now, this is political revolutionary rhetoric of the highest order. And from a psychological point of view, God's declarations wound Satan's sense of rank, inspires and awakens envy towards the Son, and produces resentment at being asked to bow down. And at that point, Satan begins to organize his followers by saying, our better part remains, to work in close design. He wanted everyone to work closely together. Now, in terms of the relevance of all of this to our world, from many projects done at Farsight, we see the current political sources of authority, and power increasingly experiencing significant stress. It has come to the point currently where we can see a path that could lead to the complete collapse of contemporary power nodes. And as I addressed in my last Spotlight talk last week, civilization is entering the wilderness, where currently authorities collapse, and there will exist a window in time when the masses of humanity will have the opportunity to make a collective free will choice to embark on a more positive and liberating path forward, free of the extraterrestrial inspired repressive manipulation of the past. Imagine that. Free of the extraterrestrial inspired repressive manipulation of the past. And to do this, the masses will need new leaders. Not leaders that force obedience, but leaders who can teach and inspire. Humanity, in Milton's terms, will need new Satans, not demons, but revolutionists who refuse to surrender their autonomy, their free will. Well, I don't know if you like singing, but now I want to introduce another creative work that illustrates the psychology of collapsing power structures, but from a completely different angle. The opera. And this is The Marriage of Figaro, composed by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, with the libretto by Lorenzo da Ponte. So, the libretto, of course, is the words. I attended a performance of this opera last night, believe it or not, right here in Atlanta, so it's very fresh on my mind. By the way, the Atlanta Opera is a Tier 1 opera, which means it's in the highest level quality of all operas in the United States, so it's a good opera company. Anyway, so I like going to the opera, and I watched The Marriage of Figaro. So, to the uninitiated, The Marriage of Figaro appears to be nothing more than a chaotic romantic comedy. And there were slapstick things that happen, like lovers hiding in closets, husbands suspecting their wives, servants overhearing secrets, and characters run across the stage in elaborate disguises. It all looks quite silly, actually. But beneath the comedic surface lies a story about the collapse of feudal authority. So this is it. The opera is based on a play by, I'm going to get this wrong, Pierre Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais. I'm sure I pronounced that incorrectly. It's a French name. And the play was so politically explosive that it was banned in many parts of Europe. When Mozart adapted the story into an opera, much of the overt political dialogue had to be removed in order to satisfy governmental censors. So, the political message, however, remained. And here's the basic plot. This is the plot of the opera. So the opera centers on several main characters whose interactions reveal the hidden instability of the feudal system. So first there is the Count, Count Almaviva. the feudal lord who technically holds authority over everyone living on his estate. So, under the traditional feudal structure, his power is absolute. His servants work for him, live on his land, and in theory must obey him without question. Ring a bell? Then there is Figaro. He's a servant who works for the Count. Now, Figaro is clever, energetic, and extremely intelligent. He's about to marry Susanna, who serves as the personal maid to the Countess. Now, the Countess herself is an important character in the story. She represents the dignity of the old aristocratic order, but she is also painfully aware of her husband, the Count, and that he has become unfaithful and manipulative. Now, there's another key character called Cherubino, a young page whose romantic infatuations create a series of complications that add to the confusion and disguise basically throughout the entire story. He's a very funny fellow. Now, at the beginning of the opera, Figaro and Susanna, who are wanting to get married, they're preparing for their wedding. And on the surface, everything appears festive and orderly, but very quickly it becomes clear that the Count has ulterior motives. Although he previously promised to abolish the feudal privilege known as the right of the lord, get this, the supposed right of a lord to sleep with a servant's bride on her wedding night. Can you imagine that? He now secretly attempts to revive this privilege in order to seduce Susanna. Well, this is where the deeper political structure of the opera begins to emerge. From a purely legal standpoint, the Count still holds enormous authority. He is the feudal lord of the estate, but the social system that supports that authority has already begun to erode. So, Susanna immediately recognizes the danger posed by the Count's intentions, and instead of submitting to his authority and sleeping with the Count, she begins working with Figaro and the Countess, the wife of the Count, to outmaneuver him. What follows is a remarkably intricate series of plans, disguises, misunderstandings, and strategic manipulations. So the servants begin quietly orchestrating events behind the scenes. They intercept letters. They overhear conversations. They hide characters in closets and under beds. And they manipulate appearances with costumes so that the Count repeatedly finds himself chasing illusions. Throughout the entire opera, the Count believes he is controlling events, but in reality he's reacting blindly to a situation that the servants are quietly managing. So this is the critical political point of the story. And for those people who look at the opera simply as a slapstick comedy, they're missing the whole point. The political point of the story is what really matters. The servants control the flow of information. And in any system of power, whoever controls information ultimately controls the system itself. Does that ring a bell, folks? Think about who controls the information that you get. As the opera progresses, the Count's attempts to manipulate the situation become increasingly desperate. His authority, which once depended on absolute unquestioned obedience, begins to unravel as his schemes are gradually exposed. So by the final act, the servants have constructed a carefully orchestrated scenario designed to reveal the Count's behavior publicly. Now, when I talk about this, I want you to think about the idea of disclosure. Disclosure, what we've been talking about for years. So through a series of disguises and mistaken identities, the Count believes that he is secretly meeting Susanna in a garden at night, but instead he ends up confronting the consequences of his own deception. When the truth becomes clear, the Count finds himself surrounded by all the characters whose lives that he has been manipulating. the truth comes out. And at that moment, something extraordinary happens. The feudal lord, the man who supposedly holds authority over the entire estate, is forced to kneel and beg for forgiveness. Talk about flipping the power structure. But notice, from whom he must ask for forgiveness. Not from a king, not from a church authority, but from his own wife, the countess, in front of the servants who have just exposed his misconduct. Well, the symbolic meaning of this moment is absolutely unmistakable. You see, the old feudal power structure collapses in full public view. Authority, which once flowed downward from the aristocrat to the servants, is suddenly reversed. The servants now control the moral and social legitimacy of the situation, and the count, who still technically possesses legal authority, has lost the one thing that actually sustains power, the belief of others in his right to rule. I hope you're all making the connection with where we are today in our society as our world enters the wilderness. And once the belief system in the opera disappears, the system itself collapses, which is exactly what we're expecting to happen on Earth very soon with the collapse of our current system. So let's move to a third example of how authority structures attempt to stabilize themselves when their legitimacy begins to weaken. Now, the first example we examined was Milton's Paradise Lost, where the monarchy of heaven is challenged by a revolutionary movement led by Lucifer. And the second example was the marriage of Figaro, where a feudal aristocrat gradually loses his authority as the servants around him begin to see through the illusion of his legitimacy. So he's not so legitimate. But the third example concerns religion. Religion is one of the most powerful systems ever created for stabilizing authority. For thousands of years, religious institutions have provided the psychological architecture that supports hierarchical systems of power. At the center of nearly every major religious doctrine lies a similar structure, a supreme authority that must be obeyed without question. Without question. And you've all seen this. You've lived through it your whole lives. And in many religious traditions, this authority takes the form of a monarchical god, a supreme ruler whose commands must be followed and whose judgments cannot be questioned. And beneath that supreme ruler sits a hierarchy of intermediaries, priests, clerics, prophets, or institutional authorities who claim to speak on behalf of that divine power. So the structure is unmistakably political. Authority flows downward. Obedience flows upward. And the masses are taught that submission to this hierarchy is not merely a social obligation, but a sacred duty. So if we look closely, we can see that the religious structure mirrors the exact same political structure that we have already examined in both Paradise Lost and the marriage of Figaro. In Milton's story, heaven is organized as a monarchy with God at the top. In the feudal system depicted by Figaro, the count sits at the top of the hierarchy. And in organized religion, the structure is nearly identical. A supreme authority demands obedience, and the system is reinforced by intermediaries who maintain the hierarchy. One of the most powerful tools by these systems is myths. Myths are not simply stories. They are psychological architectures that shape how populations understand authority and morality and obedience. And through myths, populations are taught who is good and who is evil, who deserves loyalty and who must be feared. From the work we have done at Farsight, across many projects, it appears that myth-making itself has often been influenced by extraterrestrial intervention. In particular, the authoritarian extraterrestrial groups that we refer to as the bad ETs appear to have played a significant role in shaping many of the religious doctrines that have dominated human history. If a population is to be controlled, one of the most effective methods is to construct a narrative that legitimizes authority and demonizes rebellion. So religious doctrine accomplishes this in several ways. First, it discourages individual autonomy. Many religious systems teach that independent thought is dangerous, even sinful. You had a thought. You're a sinner. And the faithful are encouraged to surrender their personal judgments and accept the authority of religious doctrine. Second, religious narratives often portray obedience as the highest virtue. Submission to divine authority becomes the defining moral standard. And third, rebellion is demonized. Those who question authority are frequently portrayed as evil, corrupt, or influenced by dark forces. So in this way, myth becomes a political instrument, and we have been experiencing that on this planet for centuries on end. The story of Satan is a perfect example. If we look at the narrative from the perspective of an authoritarian power structure, Satan represents the archetypal rebel. He questions authority. He refuses to submit. He challenges the legitimacy of the ruling hierarchy. From the perspective of a ruling authority, such a figure must be demonized. And if rebellion is to be prevented, the rebel must be portrayed as the embodiment of evil itself. And this is exactly what happens in many religious traditions. The rebel becomes the devil. But if we step back and examine the structure of the story, something interesting emerges. The arguments that Satan makes in Paradise Lost are not simply irrational outbursts of evil. They are political arguments. They are arguments about autonomy, equality, and resistance to centralized authority. In other words, the figure that religion has taught humanity to fear may in fact represent something much more complicated. The archetype of rebellion against authoritarian control. From the perspective of authoritarian systems, this is extremely dangerous. And if populations begin to reinterpret their myths, if they begin to question whether the stories that they have been told were written by victors rather than the losers, then the entire structure of authority begins to destabilize. And that brings us back to the moment we are living through now. Across many of our projects at Farsight, we have observed increasing signs that the long-standing structures of authority on Earth are entering a period of significant stress. Political systems that once appeared stable are showing signs of fragmentation, big time. Institutional authority is weakening, and narratives that once commanded widespread belief are increasingly being questioned. In other words, the psychological foundation that sustains these systems, the belief in their legitimacy, is beginning to erode. And once that erosion begins, history shows that the collapse of the system itself often follows. Now, I know a lot of this is heavy going, but for the moment, I would like to reflect on the practicality of making these arguments stick in the mass public's mind. Well, this past week, when I was literally out in the wilderness, with my camper making a video of recordings of UFO spacecraft right overhead are reflected on how powerful this act of filmmaking actually is. It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the struggles that I have just outlined really exist. There are a huge number of extraterrestrials operating on and near Earth, all using stealth technology to hide their presence, precisely to hide from humanity the true nature of this planet's imprisonment. I can capture all of this on demand, on video, and I can show others how to do it. Earth is a psychological prison, and if it became widely known that the ET spacecraft are all over the place and all hiding from human eyes, it would really help wake up humanity to see the true human dilemma clearly. And friends, then I deeply reflected on what I was doing with my camera. Now, I'm not boasting, but I do consider myself a handsome man. And to be honest, I do appreciate the striking power of a beautiful woman. But I know that these two things are not equivalent. At the moment, when I was recording live ET spacecraft flying over my own head, I noted how powerless I was to bring this information to the masses. My own presence, however handsome and charismatic, simply did not have the power to penetrate the blocking psychological barriers that restrict humanity from seeing that which they need to see in order to be free. Well, upon seeing that reflection, I noted that I could destroy all of those mental barriers, crash through the tyranny of the oppressors and their psychological grip on the repressed human masses. If instead of me showing people how to make such video recordings, it was rather a striking youthful female beauty in a bikini. It seems nearly humorous to me that the fate of humanity may rest on the sexy power of a woman's butt. But I digress. What all of these examples have in common is the same structural moment in history. The moment when people stop believing in the legitimacy of the authority that governs them. In Paradise Lost, Lucifer and the angels stop believing in heaven's monarchy. They stop believing that heaven's monarchy deserves their obedience. And once that psychological shift occurs, rebellion becomes inevitable. The war in heaven begins not because Lucifer suddenly becomes evil, but because he stops believing in the authority above him and its legitimacy. So in the marriage of Figaro, the same process occurs in a much smaller setting. The Count still technically possesses authority over everyone on the estate. The legal structure has not changed, and the title of the Count still exists. The hierarchy is still written into the social order, but the people around him, the servants, his wife, even the young page Cherubino, no longer truly believe in the legitimacy of that authority. And once that belief disappears, the Count's power collapses, and he must kneel and ask forgiveness in front of the very people he once ruled. The same exact process has occurred repeatedly throughout human history. Monarchies have fallen when populations stopped believing that kings possessed divine authority. Empires have collapsed when their citizens no longer believed that the imperial structure served their interests. And political systems disintegrate when the narratives that once sustained them lose their persuasive power. And now we arrive at the moment where we are living through today. Across the world, we are seeing increasing signs that the psychological foundations of authority are beginning to fracture. Institutions that once commanded unquestioned obedience now face widespread skepticism. The narratives that once shaped public understanding are being openly challenged. Entire populations are beginning to question whether the structures that govern their lives are legitimate at all. This is what I described in my previous spotlight when I spoke about civilization entering the wilderness. The wilderness is not simply a period of chaos. It is the interval between the collapse of one system of authority and the emergence of another. And during this interval, the old myths lose their power, but the new structures have not yet fully formed. So history shows that this is the most dangerous phase of any civilization transition. When systems of authority collapse, those who benefited from those systems rarely surrender power quietly. They attempt to restore control through fear, through propaganda, through the manipulation of information, and through the reinforcement of old myths that once kept the populations obedient. So in this sense, the mythological battle described by Milton is not merely a poetic story, it is a pattern that repeats itself whenever hierarchical systems of power are challenged. Revolutions are never simple struggles between good and evil. They are struggles between competing visions of authority. One side seeks to preserve hierarchy and control, and the other side seeks autonomy and freedom. At Farsight, we have been studying this pattern for many years, not only in human political systems, but in the broader context of extraterrestrial civilizations. Again and again we encounter the same conflict. Authoritarian structures that demand obedience confronting cultures that insist on the right of individual autonomy. The question that confronts humanity now is the same question that confronted the angels in Milton's story. What happens when people no longer believe that authority deserves their obedience? When that moment arrives, something extraordinary becomes possible. For the first time in generations, populations have the opportunity to decide what kind of system they wish to live under. They can continue to accept structures built on fear and enforced obedience, or they can begin building systems rooted in autonomy, cooperation, and free will. That choice cannot be forced. It must be made consciously. And that is why the work we do at Farsight is so important at this moment in history. Our goal is not to create another authority structure that demands obedience. Our goal is to help people understand the forces shaping their world so that they can make their own decisions with clarity and independence. So in Milton's language, the rebels of heaven were willing to risk everything rather than surrender their autonomy. I'm not suggesting that humanity should imitate Satan in any literal sense, but Milton understood something profound about the psychology of revolution. The desire for freedom is extraordinarily powerful. Once people begin to recognize that they have the right to choose their own path, the structures that depend on unquestioned obedience begin to lose their hold. We are entering such a moment now. Civilization is entering the wilderness. And the future will be shaped by those who are willing to see the structure of the old system clearly, question its legitimacy, and imagine what might come next. If you want to understand these forces more deeply, that is exactly the work we do at Farsight. Through our projects and remote viewing investigations, we are examining the larger structures shaping the human situation on this planet. If this subject matters to you, you can explore much more of this work at FARSIGHTPrime.com. I want to thank everybody for joining me today. We had a great turnout, actually, and it looks like the chat has been quite lively. So I want to thank everybody for being here, and I hope you're going to be with me again next week. Sunday, same time, same channel, same place, where we will continue the discussion. I'll see you all then, all right? Take care.